cowardly, craven cowardice of our original venue, which cancelled under the fire of some tweets and a couple of emails, and cancelled a venue with a former Glasgow Member of Parliament as the Speaker. In Govan, of all places, a fastness of hard men, they ran away from some tweets and some emails, and I for one will never forgive them for that. I gave my first speech in Glasgow almost 50 years ago, 49 years ago. And this will probably, for a variety of reasons, political and practical, be the last speech that I make in Glasgow. And I'm glad that I can make it to you, and with no rain so far. I brought the sunshine with me. So under blue skies, we now address this question of NATO. And I want to start by saying that NATO has no real friends in Glasgow. Some people have been fooled into thinking that the Ukraine is a noble cause, is one that right-thinking people should be supporting. Some fools think it's about self-determination, and because a lot of people in Scotland are down with that issue, they think it's an issue that they need to embrace. Some, from residual hatred of the Soviet Union, of communism and so on, think that they've got to hate Russia, whatever she does, whether in the right or in the wrong. They've grown up on Cold War propaganda, which makes them instinctively hostile to Russia. But the main reason is that we have been subjected to a full spectrum assault on our senses, and many of us have lost our senses. Many of us imagine that the war in Ukraine began on February 25th last year, when in fact anyone who's been paying attention knows that this war began at least in 2014, arguably long before that, according to NATO themselves. Jens Stoltenberg, the Norwegian tailor who for the moment runs NATO, boasted that NATO have been in Ukraine since 2008. And you can date it even further back than that, in the colour revolutions, the orange revolution, better not say that round here, and so on. This is a war that the last thing you could possibly describe it as is unprovoked, as that Egypt King Charles did in the German parliament of all places just a couple of days ago. You can say it's wrong, you could say Russia did the wrong thing, but the last thing you could say is that it was unprovoked. Even NATO doesn't claim that it was unprovoked. Even NATO boasts that they have been building up the armed forces of Ukraine. Well, as what was her name said to the wife of Paul Daniels, the widow of Paul Daniels, what first attracted you to the multi-millionaire Paul Daniels? What first attracted NATO to Ukraine? You don't need to be Einstein to work that out. Of all the places they could have gone, after all, they've been acting out of area for now 2 decades. The most recent candidate member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was Colombia in South America, as far from the North Atlantic as you could get. What first attracted NATO to Colombia? The fact that it was next door to Venezuela. and that they wanted to achieve regime change in Venezuela. Again, you don't need to be that bright to work these things out. They accepted Colombia as a candidate member because they hated Hugo Chavez and then Nicolas Maduro, and they wanted to bring him down. And that's the same reason why they were in Ukraine, according to Stoltenberg, as early as 2008. But let's say the proximate reason for this war today was the violent overthrow under shot and shell of the president, the legitimate elected president of Ukraine in 2014. Thousands gathered in the Maidan. Even the Western journalists reported it copiously. You can find it, just Google it, their reports of the events in the Maidan in 2014. Overwhelmingly far-right militias, organizations, individuals, openly Nazi individuals. They weren't hiding it, they were flying swastikas. They were tattooing them on their skin. They gathered in the Maidan to overthrow the elected government. But they were not succeeding, despite, maybe because of the steady stream of American and European politicians bringing them cookies and succor and comfort. Victoria Nuland, the angel of death of several American administrations, was literally walking amongst them, handing out cookies to the protesters. But they weren't winning. So they arranged, and again, this is not contested. There's footage to prove that they themselves fired on the protesters in the Maidan, killing many of them, wounding scores of them, creating total panic, and then moved up a gear into full-scale regime change operation. And they stormed the Parliament building. They set it on fire. The president had to flee in the night, under fire. He landed in the middle of a field somewhere, 1,000 miles from Kiev. The Parliament members were literally, and again, this is not contested. There's footage, BBC footage, showing armed gunmen inside the Ukrainian Parliament holding their guns at the heads of the legislature to force them to sign a decree on pain of death to accept a resignation of a president that had never been proffered. They said he'd fled, but he was still in the country. The laws of Ukraine set very clear rules for the removal of a president, none of which were met. And then they forced the members of the parliament to sign a decree to ban the use of the Russian language throughout Ukraine. Ban it in schools, ban it in official documents, ban it in all spheres of public life. Now that was a problem because 40% of the people of Ukraine are Russian-speaking people. You've got to understand that, you know, history doesn't begin when Sky News turns up. The whole basis of Ukraine, its borders, its institutions were all Soviet institutions. Actually, modern Ukraine was created by Lenin, and then by Stalin, and then by Khrushchev, who literally gave away in a drunken night the Crimean Peninsula from Russia to Ukraine, even though it had been Russian for many centuries, almost a millennia prior to that. So 40% of the Ukrainian people were Russian speakers, including President Zelensky, who is a Russian-speaking Ukrainian. Actually, he can barely speak Ukrainian. He can't speak it properly, a point that none of your media has made to you. So he would have been banned from using his own language in Ukraine. Well, what was the reaction? The reaction was obvious in the Russian-speaking areas. They said, we will not accept that. We don't accept the overthrow of our president. We don't accept the banning of our language. We will not accept the outlawing of our culture. We don't accept your coup d'etat. And so the new authorities in Kiev, with the full backing of the European Union and the United States, sent their armed forces to kill those people, and kill them in huge numbers. They did every single day. Again, this is not contested. The records of the OSCE, not me or the Morning Star, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, have copiously recorded, right down to every last incident, the shelling, rocketing, and firing into civilian areas in eastern Ukraine by the Kiev authorities. They killed 14,000 people, many of them women and children. A very small minority of them, anything that could be described as a combatant. The great majority of them civilians, a huge number of them women and children. They killed them every day. And again, all the Western media reported this, but have now wiped it from their collective discourse and therefore from the memory of many of our people. And they were about, on the 25th of February, to finish the job. Zelensky gathered 100,000 soldiers on the line of control, separating the self-proclaimed People's Republics of Lugansk and Donetsk, the Russian-speaking areas, from the Ukrainian state-held territory. They were about to invade again. So how can you call that, King Charles? How can you call that unprovoked? That's the last thing that it is unprovoked. If the Russian government had stood by and allowed an onslaught against people who are Russian people, and watched the ethnic cleansing that would have ensued, how long could that Russian government have stayed in power? You could argue, I would, that they should have done this in 2014, when the coup took place. But I guess Russia was not as strong politically, economically, militarily in 2014 as it is today. But they did it on the 25th of February of last year. And they're not going to undo it. And therefore, every tranche of money and weapons and materiel that is sent to Ukraine can have only one outcome: to prolong a war that cannot possibly be won. If I was to go into the geopolitical military realities, I would say this. I'll say it in shorthand. No nuclear power can be defeated in a conventional war in the country next door. How could it allow itself to be? If America was fighting China in Mexico, would it allow itself to be defeated by China in Mexico, or would it escalate into the use of all of its weaponry to make sure that it prevailed. So ipso facto, Russia cannot lose this war, which means to prolong it is merely to prolong the agony and the suffering of the people of Ukraine. And that is what has happened. My estimate, it's not official, is that Ukraine has lost 400,000 soldiers in this war. In Bakhmut alone, they've probably lost 50,000 soldiers. And Bakhmut fell yesterday, leaving now vast areas of eastern and southern Ukraine open to Russian advance. They say that Ukraine is planning a counter-offensive. I don't know if that is true, but if it is true, it is futile for the reasons I've just tried to explain. And therefore, our demand for a negotiated, peaceful settlement to this conflict surely is unanswerable. We're not the people who want war in Ukraine. It's NATO that wants war in Ukraine. We want the war to finish in Ukraine tomorrow. And we want it to finish on a politically satisfactory basis, which was always possible. I want to introduce to you something called the Minsk agreements, which, if they had been implemented, would have ended this conflict before it began, would have ensured that not a shot was fired any further. What did the Minsk agreements, which incidentally were not just signed by the Ukrainian government, but were guaranteed by the governments of Germany and France, and then adopted by the Security Council of the United Nations, thus becoming the property of the much vaunted international community, without demur, by the way. Not one member of the Security Council declined to support the adoption of the Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements would have given autonomy of the kind that we have here in Scotland for the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, but still within the Ukrainian state. The Minsk agreements would have guaranteed the neutrality of Ukraine. Not just that it wouldn't join NATO, because Stoltenberg's already told us that even though they were not in NATO, NATO was in them since, according to him, 2008. So proper neutrality. No Ukraine in NATO, no NATO in Ukraine. And the demobilization and disarming of the openly Nazi militia that proliferate in Ukraine. If this was a never-ending speech, I'd talk to you about the Holocaust in the East, where, not even waiting for the SS, the hordes, the black hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian nationalists killed millions of Jews, of Poles, of Ukrainians who opposed them, millions, and not in gas chambers either, up close and personal, standing on their bodies in pits as they murdered them. That's the reality of the far-right ultra-nationalist Ukrainian forces, then and now. So that was the Minsk agreements. But Mrs. Merkel, I've just remembered it was Mrs. Merton was the name I was searching for earlier in Paul Daniel. Mrs. Merkel admitted that the Minsk agreements were only a device to gain time for NATO to build up the Ukrainian armed forces. And Sarkozy, the French president who guaranteed them, concurred. Yes, they were never intended to be implemented It was a big lie, one of many big lies in this whole story. Now, I want to move on to, if you like, the broader context in which all this is happening. The world is changing underneath our feet. Those of you who follow these things already know that. The great changes, the marriage between Russia and China, creates a new political reality that the United States cannot bear, literally cannot bear. For 40 years since Nixon, 50, 60 years since Nixon, they have had as an article of faith the necessity to keep Russia and China as far apart from each other as it's possible. Now they've become effectively one country, using their own currencies to trade with each other, the one providing the things the other doesn't have. China's gigantic manufacturing and financial power is now married to Russia's vast treasures of the basic commodities and elements that every Western as well as Eastern economy requires, from oil and gas to lithium to gold to fertilizer to foodstuff and all these other basic commodities. This is a war, someone said, between capital and commodities. And commodities are winning. Hallelujah, I say, as someone that has opposed the rule of capital all of my life. It turns out that financial services are no match for oil and gas, are no match for all the things that Russia has. So this marriage between Russia and China, now joined by Iran, by India, by Brazil, by South Africa, and now, astonishingly, by Saudi Arabia, which has kissed and made up with Iran, imagine, under the auspices of China. Once upon a time, these things used to be done at Camp David or on the White House lawn. Now they're done in China. In China this week are the President of France, the Prime Minister of Spain, the head of the European Union, and the President of Brazil, just this week. I don't know how they're going to fit them all in the hotel space. All roads lead to China. And this new political, economic, financial reality. I saw Cruz, Senator Ted Cruz today, actually complaining that countries are now trading with each other in their own currency. Talk about exceptionalism. He denounced countries like India trading its commodities in its own currency. Why? Well, he was honest. Because we'll not be able to sanction them anymore. Hallelujah! The days when the United States could bully and sanction and invade and occupy other countries is rapidly coming to an end. Rapidly coming to an end. And that is the background, the context in which this Ukraine conflict is being fought. So my view is this, and I hope that it's also yours. There's nothing in it for us to continue American domination of the world. What did it ever do for us? We got nothing from it, so why are we doing it? As a result of the decisions made by our government, the Scottish government in full support, by the way, just don't forget that, has been to devastate our own economy, to harm ourselves. It's a self-harming enterprise. We are committing national suicide, and Europe is committing continental economic suicide for Joe Biden. I mean, JFK you can understand, but Joe Biden? Have you seen Joe Biden? And we are killing ourselves for him, for his leadership of the world, for Senator Ted Cruz to be able to go on sanctioning people whenever he pleases. This is a kind of madness. It is national madness. It is European madness. And people are now waking up to it. If not in our country, although this is very healthy considering all the circumstances, if not in our country, they certainly are in France. Have you seen them in France? Well, you didn't see them on the BBC. You could only have seen it on social media because it hasn't been in the so-called legacy media. The people in France are out on the streets in their millions every day. And one of their principal demands, when it does get reported in Britain, they tell us it's a protest about pensions. All these 20-year-olds are running around setting fire to France about a pension they may or may not get 45 years from now. No, this protest in France, which continues, is about the whole neoliberal economic system that we suffer under here as well as there. It's about the whole imperial system of American domination, which we suffer from here as well as they do there. And they are demanding France out of NATO, no more weapons to Ukraine, no more war in Ukraine. That should be and is our demand here also. And these protests are spreading in Germany, in France, in Hungary, in Slovakia, in Croatia even, in many other parts of the European continent. My last points are these, because it's getting chilly. My last points are these. Why are they so afraid of our organization, No to NATO, No to War? I'll tell you why. Because we are different from other peace organizations, God bless them. We're not pacifists. I'll fight anybody. We're not pacifists. And we're not of the, on the one hand, but on the other, a plague on both your houses. No, not us. We say the fault in this conflict lies with NATO. And the fault in so many conflicts lies with NATO. And that the only conclusion is for us to get out of NATO before they drag us into World War III. Why did NATO invade and occupy and destroy Libya? What does Libya have to do with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization? Why were they firing depleted uranium weapons into Yugoslavia to destroy it? And Serbian women are still giving birth to deformed children, even today, more than 20 years after that bombardment. What does Afghanistan have to do with NATO? You really don't need to be that clever to work out that this is not a defensive organization. It's a gang. You're right, madam. It is a gang. It's an American gang, led by the kind of gangsters in disguise that now run American politics, at least for now. They're even shanghaiing their own president in New York tomorrow. I'm no fan of Donald Trump, but at least he says stop the war in Ukraine. Maybe that's why they're arresting him. Who knows? It can't be for paying hush money to a hooker, because they all pay hush money to hookers. Well, it's certainly to do with the fact that he's a bull in a china shop and they never know what he's going to knock over next. And it might be he knocks over some very important pieces of china belonging to them. So, in conclusion, I hope that you'll support No to NATO, No to War. I hope you'll join us. It doesn't cost anything. I hope you'll follow us on all our platforms on social media, and when sense returns and we're able to book a hall. I used to fill halls in Glasgow. Now I can't even book a hall in Glasgow. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Thank you very much.